How could a child carrying no weapon become stronger than the empire that demanded he surrender the bread of life? Dear friends, welcome to the Saint Lives. Please share where and when you are listening. Subscribe and join our gentle community as ancient Rome returns through memory once again tonight. In an age when Christians worshipped beneath the shadow of persecution, young Tarcisius carried the Eucharist close to his heart and, through one final act of fidelity, became a lasting witness that love may guard what force can never possess. To understand the treasure Tarcisius carried at the end of his life, the story must first return to the world that received him. It was Rome in the 3rd century after the birth of Christ, a city so vast and powerful that many who walked beneath its temples and triumphal arches believed its glory could never fade. From distant provinces came merchants with dyed cloth, soldiers with dust upon their sandals, officials bearing messages sealed in wax, and travelers speaking languages gathered from every shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Carts rolled over worn stones from the first light of morning. Water poured from public fountains. Smoke rose from workshops where metal was hammered and bread was baked. At crowded markets, vendors called out the names of fruits, oils, fish, and spices, while children slipped between the stalls, laughing and chasing one another beneath the patient gaze of their mothers. Above them stood monuments to emperors whose names were carved deeply into marble, as though stone itself could promise that they would never be forgotten. Yet somewhere within this immense city, in a house whose location history has not preserved, a child named Tarcisius entered the world almost without notice. No surviving record tells the day of his birth. No ancient account gives the names of his parents or describes the face of the mother who first held him. The streets of his earliest years are unknown, and no one can now identify the window through which he watched the Roman sunlight, or the doorway from which he first stepped into the restless city. History, which carefully counted emperors, armies, taxes, and victories, remained silent about the beginning of this child's life. And perhaps there is something gentle and fitting in that silence, for Tarcisius would not become holy by seeking recognition. He would become holy by protecting a hidden presence, by holding close to his heart the one whom much of Rome could not see. The city into which he was born was filled with religion. Incense burned before the statues of Roman gods. Families kept small household shrines. Soldiers invoked divine protection before battle, and public ceremonies joined worship to loyalty toward the empire. To refuse these observances could appear not only unusual, but dangerous. Christians were sometimes accused of rejecting the peace of society because they would not offer sacrifice to the gods or treat the emperor as divine. Their true lives, however, were usually far quieter than the rumors told about them. They raised children, cared for elderly relatives, practiced trades, visited the sick, fed the poor, and prayed for the very rulers who misunderstood them. They did not possess great temples or political influence. They gathered as a family formed not by rank or citizenship, but by baptism and faith in Jesus Christ. A slave could kneel beside a merchant, a widow beside a soldier, and a child beside someone whose hair had grown white through many seasons of patient hope. The Christians believed that Christ had conquered death, but they also knew that confessing his name could bring suffering. Their courage therefore grew within ordinary life, around tables where bread was shared, beside beds where the sick were comforted, and in rooms where prayers were spoken softly after nightfall. It was within such a world that the young Tarcisius would have learned to listen. One may imagine him waking to the familiar sounds of Roman morning, hearing sandals upon stone and voices rising from neighboring homes. He may have watched shafts of light move slowly across a wall as the day began. He may have known the delight of simple games, the hunger that came before an evening meal, and the security of being called by name by those who loved him. He was not born carrying the solemn expression of a martyr. Like every child, he first had to be held, fed, instructed, corrected, and forgiven. His courage did not arrive complete. It would grow quietly through trust, obedience, prayer, and the example of believers who showed him that faithfulness was possible. This is important to remember, especially when the final moments of a saint appear so far above ordinary human strength. The saints were not strangers to weakness. Grace did not remove their humanity. It entered their humanity and patiently transformed it. Before Tarcisius could stand firm upon a dangerous road, he had to learn where firmness came from. Before his hands could guard the Eucharist, they may have been small hands reaching for guidance. Before his name belonged to the whole church, it was simply the name by which someone called him home. Around him, Rome displayed earthly power in countless forms. Magistrates passed with attendants. Wealthy citizens traveled in comfort. Soldiers carried weapons that announced the authority of the state. Great buildings seemed to declare that strength belonged to those who commanded others. Tarcisius possessed none of these things. He had no office, no fortune, and no army. His life began among the countless unnoticed lives that filled the narrow streets and modest rooms beyond the grand monuments. Yet the Christian faith was teaching him another understanding of greatness. In the gospel, the mighty could be brought low and the humble lifted up. A widow's small offering could be precious in the sight of God. A cup of water given with love could possess eternal meaning. A child could be welcomed by Christ and placed before adults as an image of the kingdom of heaven. Such teachings quietly overturned the values proclaimed by Rome. They suggested that the deepest victories might occur where no crowd applauded, and that the strongest heart might belong to the person who surrendered everything out of love. Still, none of those around Tarcisius could yet have known how completely his life would reveal this mystery. They could not have foreseen a day when the empire's vast roads, built for armies and officials, would become the setting for the final journey of a Christian youth carrying the bread of life. They could not have imagined that marble monuments would crumble while his fragile act of faithfulness would be remembered across distant lands and through many centuries. For now, he remained only a boy growing beneath the Roman sky, surrounded by common sounds and small responsibilities. The future waited beyond him like a road turning out of sight. The church itself was also learning to live without knowing what the next day would bring. Seasons of uneasy peace could be followed by sudden persecution. A neighbor might be friendly, indifferent, or suspicious. A believer might attend prayer one evening and be arrested before the next gathering. Yet Christian families continued to baptize their children, teach the words of Christ, remember the apostles, and celebrate the sacred mysteries. They trusted that God was present not only in moments of deliverance, but also in uncertainty. That trust formed the unseen shelter around Tarcisius. It was more enduring than stone walls, and more intimate than the crowded city surrounding him. Within it, his soul began its pilgrimage long before his feet followed the road that would make his name known. Rome did not write down the morning of his life, yet heaven would remember the evening toward which he was quietly walking. And within that unrecorded childhood, the first light of faith would have reached him through voices gentle enough not to attract the world outside. The Christian faith in 3rd century Rome was often passed from heart to heart before it was ever expressed before a crowd. It lived in the prayers of parents, in the courage of widows, in the kindness of neighbors, and in the memories of elderly believers who had known seasons of both peace and persecution. If Tarcisius was born into a Christian household, as later tradition naturally imagined, then the name of Jesus may have been among the first sacred names he learned to recognize. Perhaps he heard it spoken in gratitude before a modest meal, whispered beside the bed of someone who was ill, or repeated slowly as evening shadows gathered upon the walls. No surviving document permits anyone to enter that household with certainty. Yet the life of the early church allows us to understand the kind of spiritual world in which his faith would have grown. Christian children did not learn their religion from public monuments or ceremonies protected by imperial authority. They learned it from people whose lives had been quietly changed by the gospel. They learned by watching adults forgive injuries, share food with those who had less, welcome strangers, and pray for prisoners whose names might never be spoken safely in the streets. In such a home, the sign of the cross was more than a familiar gesture. It was a brief confession that life belonged to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that suffering itself could be transformed by the love revealed upon Calvary. Tarcisius may first have traced that sign awkwardly, as children often imitate a movement before understanding its meaning. A patient hand may have guided his own from forehead to breast and from shoulder to shoulder. In time, the gesture would become natural, accompanying him at waking, before sleep, and whenever fear approached. What begins in childhood as imitation can slowly become conviction, and what is repeated with innocent trust may one day become the strength by which an entire life is offered. The stories told to Tarcisius would also have formed his imagination. He may have heard of Abraham leaving the security of his homeland because God had called him, of Moses leading a frightened people through the sea, and of young David standing before a warrior who seemed impossible to defeat. Yet above all, he would have heard about Jesus of Nazareth, who welcomed children, touched the sick, forgave sinners, and spoke of a kingdom unlike the kingdoms of the earth. Jesus possessed no palace and commanded no legion. He entered Jerusalem in humility, washed the feet of his disciples, and accepted the cross, rather than answer violence with violence. To a child growing beneath the shadow of imperial power, this story offered a new vision of strength. Rome taught that victory meant overcoming an enemy. Christ taught that the greatest victory was to love faithfully, even when love demanded sacrifice. Tarcisius could not yet have understood how closely his own path would follow that teaching, but the words were settling within him like seeds beneath the soil. He also learned that the cross was not the end of the story. The women who went to the tomb at dawn found the stone rolled away, and the disciples who had scattered in fear became witnesses to the resurrection. This promise gave Christian homes a quiet joy that persecution could not entirely extinguish. Death was mourned, but it was not treated as a locked door. Those who died in Christ were remembered as members of a living communion, awaiting the resurrection of the body and the life of the world to come. For Tarcisius, such hope may initially have been understood through the simple confidence of childhood. If someone he loved died, he would have been told that the separation was real, but not eternal. If he passed a funeral procession or saw mourners beside a grave, he could remember that Christ had entered death and opened a way through it. The Roman world around him might regard such belief as foolishness, but inside the Christian family, it was the foundation upon which courage rested. There were also moments when the adults around him may have lowered their voices. A name would be mentioned, followed by silence. Someone expected at the evening meal might not arrive. News could come that a bishop had been questioned, a deacon imprisoned, or a gathering discovered. Children often sense fear before they understand its cause. Noticing a pause in conversation, or the way a parent listens when footsteps stop outside the door. Tarcisius may have asked why Christians needed to be careful if they had done nothing wrong. The answer would not have been easy. He would have learned that people sometimes fear what they do not understand, and that loyalty to Christ could be mistaken for disloyalty to Rome. Yet those who instructed him would also have warned him against hatred. Christians were called to pray for rulers, respect lawful authority, and refuse revenge. Their struggle was not against human beings, but against sin, falsehood, and the fear that tempted the heart to abandon what it knew to be true. This lesson was difficult even for adults. For a boy, it must have unfolded slowly, through questions that returned in different forms as he grew older. Why did good people suffer? Why did God not always remove danger? How could someone forgive an accuser? The early church did not answer these questions with easy promises of safety. It pointed instead toward Christ, whose innocence did not spare him from the cross, and whose suffering became the place where divine love was most fully revealed. Grace was not presented as an escape from trial, but as the presence of God within it. In learning this, Tarcisius began to understand that faith meant more than believing comforting truths. It meant entrusting oneself to Christ when the road ahead remained uncertain. Still, his childhood should not be imagined as a life of uninterrupted solemnity. Faith would have entered ordinary happiness as naturally as it entered fear. There were meals shared with laughter, familiar songs, stories repeated at the request of children, and mornings when sunlight made every danger seem far away. He may have helped carry water, gathered small pieces of wood, or delivered something to a neighbor. He would have made mistakes, grown impatient, and needed correction. Those around him did not raise a symbol carved from perfect stone. They cared for a living child whose character was formed through daily choices. When he admitted a fault, forgave another child, completed an unwanted duty, or remained truthful when dishonesty would have been easier, something within him became strong. None of these actions appeared heroic, yet martyrdom is seldom created in a single instant. The final choice reveals a heart shaped by many earlier choices that passed unnoticed. Tarcisius learned fidelity through the humble rhythm of home, where love asked him to be attentive before it ever asked him to be brave. His baptism, whenever it occurred, placed this quiet formation within the mystery of grace. Through water and the invocation of the Holy Trinity, he became a member of Christ's body and a brother to believers scattered far beyond Rome. The distinction between citizen and foreigner, rich and poor, free and enslaved, did not disappear from society, but within the Church it no longer determined a person's worth. Tarcisius belonged to a people whose true homeland was the kingdom of God. This belonging gave him an identity deeper than the approval of neighbors or the protection of the state. As he grew, he would discover that the Christian family extended into hidden gatherings, burial places, prisons, and distant communities he would never see. Their prayers joined his own, and their suffering concerned him because baptism had made them one. The faith entered his heart without noise, like a lamp being lit behind a shuttered window. The little lamp kindled at home soon drew Tarcisius toward a larger family, hidden beneath the restless streets of the city. As he grew old enough to accompany trusted adults beyond the familiar protection of his household, he would have discovered that belonging to Christ joined him to men and women whose lives were very different from his own. Some Christians possessed comfortable homes in which believers could gather, while others lived in narrow rooms above workshops or slept near the places where they labored. Some had been born in Rome, and others had come from Africa, Greece, Syria, Gaul, or lands still farther away. They spoke with different accents and carried different memories. Yet when they prayed together, they called upon one Father and listened to one gospel. The church was not a building that announced itself above the rooftops. It was a living communion, recognized in the breaking of bread, in care for the poor, and in fidelity to the teaching handed down from the apostles. Tarcisius may have entered a house where curtains were drawn and voices kept low, then found the room slowly filling with people who greeted one another as brothers and sisters. A widow might make space for a laborer. An elderly man might bend to bless a child. Someone who had recently been released from questioning might be welcomed without being pressed to describe what had happened. The gathering was careful, but it was not joyless. Fear stood outside like a shadow, while within, psalms and prayers reminded the believers that Christ remained among them. There was another place where Tarcisius could encounter the memory of this family with particular tenderness. Beyond the busiest districts of Rome, roads led past walls, gardens, tombs, and burial grounds. Along the Appian Way and other routes lay underground cemeteries, now known as the catacombs. They were not, as later imagination sometimes suggested, a secret city in which all Christians constantly hid from Roman soldiers. They were chiefly places of burial, dug into soft, volcanic earth, where the faithful laid their dead to rest and returned to remember them in prayer. Yet, for a Christian child, descending into those passages could still feel like entering a world removed from the noise and pride above. Daylight narrowed behind him. The air became cool. Small lamps cast trembling circles upon walls cut by human hands. Long corridors opened into other corridors, and rows of burial niches testified silently to lives that had ended in hope. The smell of earth and oil mingled in the stillness. Footsteps sounded different there, as though the ground itself asked every visitor to move more slowly. Tarcisius may have held close to an older companion as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He would have seen simple marks scratched or painted near the graves: a fish, an anchor, a shepherd carrying a sheep, or the first letters of the name of Christ. These were not ornaments of wealth. They were small declarations that the person resting there had placed hope in the Lord. An anchor spoke of confidence amid the storms of life. A shepherd recalled Jesus seeking the lost and carrying the weak. A fish could quietly confess a faith too precious to display carelessly in hostile surroundings. Each sign transformed the darkness. The dead were not abandoned to forgetfulness, and their resting places were not regarded as chambers of despair. They slept in Christ, awaiting the day when death would surrender all that it had taken. Some graves carried names, others preserved only a brief prayer or affectionate remembrance. Many offered no account of the person's achievements, possessions, or social rank. Here, the distinctions that governed Roman life appeared strangely fragile. Marble titles and public honors belonged to the city above, but beneath the earth, what mattered was faithfulness. Tarcisius could have paused before the resting place of a child not much younger than himself, and wondered about the family that had wept there. He may have seen a mother touch the stone beside a loved one's grave, or heard an elder speak a name that was still painful to pronounce. Christian hope did not forbid sorrow. Jesus himself had wept at the tomb of Lazarus. The difference was that grief no longer stood alone. It was accompanied by the promise that those united with Christ would not be separated forever. Among the people buried in these cemeteries were martyrs whose deaths remained vivid in the memory of the Roman Church. Their stories were not told to entertain or frighten children. They were remembered because the martyrs had shown what grace could accomplish in ordinary human beings. Some had been teachers, servants, mothers, soldiers, or ministers of the Church. They had known anxiety and bodily weakness, yet when forced to choose between denying Christ and losing their earthly lives, they remained faithful. Tarcisius may have listened as one such story was recounted beside a grave. The voice speaking would not need to rise. In the underground stillness, every word could be heard. Perhaps the boy wondered whether the martyrs had felt afraid. He may have expected courage to mean the absence of fear, only to learn that Christian courage meant trusting God while fear was still present. The martyrs had not sought suffering, and the Church did not teach believers to provoke their persecutors. Life was a gift to be protected. But there were moments when protecting life at any cost would require the betrayal of something greater than life. And then the martyrs chose Christ. This truth entered Tarcisius gently, before circumstances would ask him to live it. In those passages, the communion of saints was no longer merely an idea spoken in prayer. It surrounded him in the testimony of the faithful departed. The living brought lamps, flowers, memories, and tears, but they also came seeking encouragement. They knew that the martyrs were not swallowed by the darkness of their graves. Their souls lived in God, and their witness strengthened the Church, still traveling through the uncertainties of the world. Tarcisius began to understand that the Christian family crossed the boundary of death. When believers prayed, they did not stand alone. They were joined to the apostles who had carried the gospel from Jerusalem, to the confessors who had endured imprisonment, and to unknown believers whose names were known perfectly to God. This larger belonging softened the loneliness that persecution tried to create. An imprisoned Christian might be separated from the congregation, but not from the body of Christ. A martyr might be removed from the streets of Rome, but not from the love of the Church. A child with little power in the world could be sustained by the prayers and examples of generations. Before leaving, Tarcisius may have watched an adult tend a fading lamp, adding oil until the flame became steady again. The action was small, yet it reflected the work of Christian memory. Faith had to be tended. Stories had to be preserved, not embellished for excitement, but carried faithfully so that those who came afterward would know they were walking a road others had already traveled. One day, the resting place of Tarcisius would lie within this sacred landscape, and another generation would pause before his name as he had paused before the names of earlier witnesses. He did not know this as he climbed again toward daylight. He knew only that the Church was older, wider, and more enduring than he had imagined. The sounds of Rome returned as he emerged, but he carried the underground silence within him. Among the resting places of the faithful, the boy learned that darkness could hold neither Christ nor those who trusted him. From the silence of the martyrs' resting places, Tarcisius was led toward the mystery that gave those martyrs their strength. He had learned that Christians did not face suffering by relying upon courage of their own making. Their perseverance flowed from communion with Christ, and nowhere was that communion received more intimately than in the Eucharist. On the Lord's Day, while much of Rome continued according to its ordinary rhythms, believers made their way toward a place chosen for worship. They did not all arrive together, and they did not draw unnecessary attention to themselves. One came carrying bread, another brought wine, and others offered food or coins to be shared with widows, orphans, prisoners, and the poor. Tarcisius may have walked beside a trusted adult through streets that appeared entirely familiar, yet his heart would have known that they were approaching something hidden and holy. Behind an unremarkable doorway, perhaps in the home of a Christian, with a room large enough to receive the community, the scattered believers gradually became one assembly. Greetings were exchanged quietly. Old injuries were forgiven, for no one wished to approach the Lord's table while clinging to bitterness. Those burdened by grief found places beside those who could comfort them. Children were kept near their families, learning when to speak and when to enter the attentive silence of prayer. Lamps cast a warm light across faces, shaped by labor, age, anxiety, and hope. Nothing in that room resembled the public grandeur of an imperial ceremony, yet Tarcisius sensed that a kingdom greater than Rome was drawing near. The sacred writings were read aloud. He listened to the words of the prophets, the memories of the apostles, and the teachings of Jesus. Some passages were familiar enough that he could silently follow them. He heard again how Christ had fed the hungry multitude in a deserted place, receiving a few loaves, giving thanks, breaking them, and placing them into the hands of his disciples. He heard how the Lord had called himself the bread of life, and promised that whoever came to him would not hunger. Most solemnly, he heard the account of the night before the crucifixion, when Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples as his body, then offered the cup as the covenant in his blood. These were not treated as distant words belonging only to the past. The Church believed that Christ's command was being obeyed whenever the community gathered for the sacred meal. What had occurred in the upper room continued through the ministry entrusted to the apostles and handed down within the Church. As the prayers moved toward the offering, Tarcisius watched the bread and wine being brought forward. They were among the simplest gifts known to ordinary life. Bread appeared each day upon humble tables. Wine was poured at meals and celebrations, yet their very simplicity made the mystery more wondrous. God had not chosen something available only to the wealthy or learned. He chose food made from the earth and shaped by human work, gifts that could be carried in common hands. The bishop or priest gave thanks according to the faith received from the apostles, recalling creation, redemption, the death of Christ, and his glorious resurrection. The assembly answered with one voice. Tarcisius could not have explained every depth of the mystery before him, and no believer, however old, could claim to understand it fully. Mystery did not mean something empty or unreal. It meant a divine reality so rich that the human mind could receive it without exhausting it. Through the prayer of the Church and the power of the Holy Spirit, the bread and wine became the sacramental presence of the body and blood of Christ. Their outward appearance remained modest, but faith recognized the Lord who had promised to remain with his people. A great stillness may have settled within Tarcisius as he watched the reverence of those around him, men and women who feared no earthly hardship, bowed before what appeared to ordinary sight to be a small portion of bread. Elderly believers extended worn hands with tenderness. Those who had lost relatives to persecution approached with tears that were not only tears of sorrow. The strong and the weak received the same Christ. No rank could purchase a greater share, and no poverty made a faithful person less welcome. Here, the divisions of Rome yielded to a deeper unity. All came hungry, and all were fed from one sacred gift. When Tarcisius himself was prepared to receive Holy Communion, whether on this day or at another moment known only to God, he would have approached with the careful instruction given to Christian children. His heart had been taught to distinguish the Eucharist from ordinary food. I knew that he was not merely joining a family custom or receiving a symbol of shared friendship. The living Christ was giving himself beneath humble appearances. Perhaps Tarcisius crossed his hands and stepped forward slowly. Perhaps he heard words announcing the body of Christ and answered with the simple affirmation of faith spoken by generations. Amen. That single word meant that he believed, accepted, and entrusted himself to the mystery he received. The one whom heaven could not contain came to dwell sacramentally within a child. For a few moments, the crowded city, the danger beyond the walls, and the uncertainties of the future may have seemed very far away. There was only gratitude and the quiet knowledge of being loved. Yet Eucharistic devotion did not remove Tarcisius from the needs of others. It joined him more deeply to them. The same Christ he received lived within the Church, especially in its suffering members. After communion, portions of the Eucharist could be reserved with profound care for believers unable to attend, particularly the sick and imprisoned. Tarcisius saw that the sacred gathering extended beyond the room. No brother or sister was to be forgotten, merely because illness, weakness, or chains prevented them from standing among the assembly. The bread of life would travel outward, carried through ordinary streets to places of loneliness. This practice revealed something essential about the Church. The Eucharist was both the sign and the source of unity. Those who received Christ became responsible for one another. To kneel in reverence before his sacramental presence while ignoring a hungry neighbor would be a contradiction. To receive the Lord, who forgave his persecutors while nurturing hatred, would leave the heart divided. Communion invited transformation. Tarcisius gradually understood that Christ did not enter him as a silent possession to be kept apart from life. He came as grace, calling the boy to become patient, truthful, generous, and brave. Each celebration deepened this invitation. The Eucharist began to shape the way Tarcisius viewed everything around him. Bread at the family table reminded him of divine generosity. A beggar at a doorway reminded him that Christ had made himself poor. An imprisoned Christian was not a distant, unfortunate person, but a member of the same body. Even his own smallness took on a new meaning. If the Lord of creation could conceal his glory beneath the appearance of bread, then weakness and humility could not be dismissed as useless. God delighted in working through what the world overlooked. This realization prepared the child for a service he could not yet foresee. He would one day hold the sacred gift against his breast and discover that devotion is measured not only by peaceful prayer, but also by fidelity when the gift is threatened. For now, however, no danger disturbed the closing moments of worship. Prayers of thanksgiving rose gently. Offerings were distributed for those in need. The believers departed by separate roads, carrying into Rome the charity they had received from Christ. Tarcisius stepped again into the daylight, where temples, soldiers, merchants, and crowds continued as before. To outward appearance, he carried nothing unusual. Yet he had encountered a presence more enduring than every monument surrounding him. He left the sacred gathering carrying nothing in his hands, yet something immeasurable had begun to dwell within his heart. Love for the Eucharist naturally became a desire to remain near it, and nearness gradually called the young believer into service. Later Christian tradition would remember Tarcisius as an acolyte, one of those entrusted with modest duties that supported the prayer and order of the community. The earliest testimony does not tell us exactly what office he held, and some have wondered whether he might have been older than later generations imagined, perhaps even serving as a deacon. Yet the image that settled most deeply within the heart of the Church was that of a youthful servant whose faithfulness had already been tested in quiet ways before it was tested upon the road. There is wisdom in approaching that tradition gently, neither claiming knowledge history has not given, nor overlooking the spiritual truth it preserves. A final act of courage rarely appears without preparation. Before Tarcisius could be trusted with the Eucharist in danger, those around him must have recognized something dependable in his character. Service gave that dependability room to grow. His first tasks would not have appeared remarkable. He may have arrived before other worshippers and helped prepare the room where the Christians would gather. Lamps needed oil, their wicks required attention, and the objects used in worship had to be placed with care. Messages might be carried to families who needed to know when and where the next gathering would occur. An elderly believer might need a steady arm along an uneven street. Food brought for the poor had to be collected and distributed without drawing notice. After the assembly departed, someone remained to restore order and ensure that nothing sacred was treated carelessly. Such work offered little praise. Indeed, the best service was often the kind that allowed everyone else to pray without thinking about who had prepared the place for them. Tarcisius learned to find joy in being useful rather than visible. At first, he may have needed reminders. A lamp could be forgotten, a message misunderstood, or youthful attention drawn toward some passing distraction. Those responsible for his formation would not have expected perfection. They would have corrected him patiently, teaching that reverence was expressed through care. To love God was not merely to feel devotion during prayer. It was to complete the duty one had accepted, to notice what others overlooked, and to perform a small task with the same integrity one would bring to a greater one. Tarcisius gradually discovered that sacred service gave ordinary actions a quiet dignity. Pouring oil, folding a cloth, opening a door, or carrying bread for the poor could become offerings when done for Christ and his people. No task was beneath love, because Jesus himself had knelt to wash the feet of his disciples. The adults around Tarcisius may have spoken often of that scene. On the night when the Lord gave the Eucharist, he also took the place of a servant. The two mysteries belonged together. One could not remain near the altar while refusing humility. If Tarcisius wished to serve the sacred mysteries, he also had to become attentive to the weary, the grieving, and those whom society ignored. Perhaps there was an elderly man in the congregation who walked slowly and spoke with difficulty. Tarcisius could learn to match his pace rather than hurry ahead. Perhaps a widow arrived carrying food for someone poorer than herself, and the boy began to understand that generosity was measured not by abundance, but by love. Perhaps a younger child became restless during prayer, giving Tarcisius an opportunity to respond with patience instead of irritation. These encounters formed him as surely as formal instruction. They taught him that service begins by seeing another person clearly. Over time, the ministers of the community would have noticed that Tarcisius no longer needed to be asked about every small responsibility. He remembered. If someone was absent, he inquired quietly. If a lamp burned low, he tended it. If the gathering required preparation, he came early. Trust grew around him almost imperceptibly. It did not come because he spoke loudly of his devotion, but because his actions became consistent. In an age when Christian communities had to exercise caution, reliability was especially precious. A careless word could expose a gathering. A message delivered to the wrong person could place lives in danger. An object treated thoughtlessly could wound the reverence of the faithful. Tarcisius learned discretion alongside generosity. He did not repeat everything he heard, nor did he use his service to make himself important among other children. Silence became part of his offering. This discipline did not make him cold or secretive. It made him trustworthy. His closeness to the Eucharist deepened as he served. He saw how the priest handled the consecrated gifts with tenderness and how the believers prepared themselves through reconciliation and prayer. He observed that nothing about the sacred mysteries was rushed. Even under pressure, reverence preserved an inner peace. Tarcisius began to imitate that peace in his own movements. He learned that holy things did not require nervous display, but loving attention. When he bowed, carried an object, or stood listening to the scriptures, he was training not only his body, but also his heart. Reverence gathered the scattered thoughts and placed them before God. It taught him to remain present. In later years, altar servers would look to Tarcisius as their patron, recognizing in him the dignity of serving near the Eucharist. Yet at this early moment, he could not have known that generations of children would bear his name, wear medals showing his image, or ask for his intercession before approaching the sanctuary. He was simply learning to serve one gathering at a time. The hiddenness of his formation is part of its beauty. Much of what prepares a soul for holiness occurs where no historian is watching. God sees the child who chooses honesty when a lie would go undiscovered, the young person who completes a duty after enthusiasm has faded, and the servant who remains gentle when no one offers thanks. These choices do not seem to change the world, but they change the heart from which future choices will arise. Tarcisius was becoming capable of a great fidelity because grace was teaching him many small fidelities. There may have been an occasion when a trusted minister gave him a responsibility slightly greater than those he had carried before. Perhaps he was asked to deliver aid to a Christian household, accompany someone vulnerable, or safeguard an item needed for worship. The precise task is lost to history, but the pattern is familiar in every community. Trust is extended, received, and confirmed through action. Tarcisius would have felt the seriousness of being depended upon. The road might have seemed longer because he was carrying something for others rather than walking only for himself. When he returned, having fulfilled the duty, there may have been no celebration, only a quiet look of approval. Yet such a look could tell him that he was no longer regarded merely as a child present among believers. He had become a servant upon whom the community could rely. The joy this gave him was not pride in being above others. It was the happiness of belonging through responsibility. The church needed every member, including the young. Christ did not wait for Tarcisius to become wealthy, influential, or old before giving purpose to his life. He asked for the heart and abilities the boy already possessed. This understanding freed Tarcisius from measuring his worth by earthly power. He could not command soldiers or speak before officials, but he could attend, remember, carry, and protect. He could offer his youth itself as a gift. And one day, when a dangerous mission required someone unlikely to be suspected, that youth would appear not as a weakness, but as a possible shield. The priest who hesitated would remember the tasks completed without complaint, the words kept in confidence, and the reverence shown before the Blessed Sacrament. The final decision had not yet arrived, but its foundation was being laid in every unnoticed act. Long before he guarded Christ with his life, Tarcisius had learned to guard small duties with love. Yet while the boy's service deepened in quietness, the world beyond the Christian gathering was becoming less forgiving. Rome had never offered its Christians complete security, and the peace they sometimes experienced could be as uncertain as a clear sky before an approaching storm. One emperor might leave them largely undisturbed, while another could revive old accusations and command officials to act against them. Local suspicion, private hostility, and public policy did not always move together, which made danger difficult to predict. A Christian family might live beside pagan neighbors for years without conflict, sharing water, exchanging food, and greeting one another in the street. Then a rumor, an imperial order, or the anger of an influential person could suddenly turn familiar surroundings into places of fear. Tradition commonly places the final days of Tarcisius during the reign of Emperor Valerian, around the middle of the 3rd century. The precise year of the martyr's death cannot be established with certainty, but the setting corresponds to an age when imperial pressure fell heavily upon the Church. At first, Valerian had not appeared determined to destroy Christian life, but the policy of the empire changed. An edict issued in the year 257 restricted Christian worship and ordered bishops, priests, and deacons to participate in Roman religious ceremonies. Those who refused could face exile, punishment, or death. Christian burial grounds and places of assembly were threatened. A second edict would make the persecution harsher still, striking ministers of the Church and believers of social rank, while confiscating property and spreading grief through many communities. These commands may have been expressed in official language, but their consequences entered ordinary homes. For Tarcisius, persecution was not an abstract conflict between an emperor and a religion. It meant familiar faces disappearing from worship. It meant hearing that a trusted minister had been questioned, or that a family had lost its home. It meant watching adults consider whether a gathering place remained safe, and whether the route used the previous week could be used again. The community continued to pray, but practical decisions now carried greater weight. Who could be trusted with a message? Which household could receive the faithful without placing its neighbors at risk? How could the sick be visited and the imprisoned supported? The Church did not cease to live. Yet almost every act of Christian love required deeper prudence. Tarcisius began to see how courage and caution could dwell together. Believers did not seek arrest, as though suffering possessed value by itself. They took reasonable steps to protect their families and one another. Jesus had sometimes withdrawn when enemies tried to seize him before his hour, and the apostles had escaped danger when escape allowed the gospel to continue. There was no shame in avoiding unnecessary exposure, but caution had a boundary. It could not become denial, and safety could not be purchased by worshiping what Christians knew was false. When ordered to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods, or treat the emperor as divine, the faithful faced a choice that no careful route or closed door could remove. They could preserve outward security by contradicting their baptism, or they could remain with Christ and accept consequences they had not chosen. The weight of that choice settled slowly upon the Christian community. One evening, Tarcisius may have arrived to serve and noticed that the gathering was smaller than usual. A place near the front remained empty. No one needed to explain immediately. Silence passed between those who knew that the missing person had been arrested. Perhaps prayers were offered without naming him aloud, because the walls themselves seemed capable of carrying information. Another family might enter late, their faces tired after leaving a home they no longer believed safe. Food would be shared with them. A corner would be found where they could rest. Children might ask questions their parents struggled to answer. In this way, persecution revealed both human cruelty and Christian charity. Every act intended to scatter the believers became an occasion for them to draw nearer to one another. Tarcisius watched those who possessed little divide it still further. He saw people frightened for their own lives care for someone in greater danger. Grace did not always appear as fearless speech before a judge. Sometimes it appeared as a blanket offered to a displaced family, or a loaf left discreetly at the door of a prisoner's wife. The boy also discovered that fear could visit devout people. A man whose prayers had always sounded steady might now speak with a trembling voice. A mother might weep after her children were asleep. A minister might pause before opening the door, listening for footsteps in the street. None of this meant their faith had failed. Human beings remained human beneath the pressure of persecution. The Church did not honor martyrs because they were incapable of fear, but because grace enabled them to remain faithful through it. This distinction mattered for Tarcisius. If holiness belonged only to those who never trembled, he might have considered it beyond his reach. But if courage meant placing one's fear into the hands of Christ and continuing in love, then even a young servant could begin to practice it. His ordinary duties acquired a new seriousness. Tending a lamp during an unlawful gathering was no longer merely preparation. Carrying assistance to a Christian household required watchfulness. Keeping a confidence protected real lives. Tarcisius learned to notice whether someone followed him, to avoid speaking sacred names carelessly in public, and to move through Rome without advertising the destination of his steps. Yet he also had to guard against allowing suspicion to harden his heart. Not every pagan neighbor was an enemy, and not every Roman soldier delighted in persecution. Some officials acted reluctantly, some citizens quietly helped Christian friends, and some who initially opposed the faith would later receive it. The gospel forbade Tarcisius from dividing the world too easily into those worthy of love and those unworthy of it. Christ had prayed for his executioners. Stephen, the first martyr, had asked forgiveness for those who stoned him. Their example would become especially important when Tarcisius faced violence of his own. As the pressure increased, stories traveled among the believers. They heard of bishops who refused to abandon their people, of deacons who continued caring for the poor, and of prisoners who sang psalms in confinement. Some accounts brought sorrow, others encouragement, and many brought both. Each name reminded the community that faithfulness had a cost, yet none of the martyrs had paid that cost alone. Christ had been present in their weakness. The Holy Spirit had given words when they were questioned, and peace when earthly judgment turned against them. Tarcisius listened, perhaps wondering what he would do if anyone asked him directly whether he was a Christian. It was easy to imagine courage while sitting among friends. It was harder when footsteps passed outside and conversation suddenly ceased. He could not know his own future response, but he could pray for the grace to be truthful when the moment came. This prayer was not a promise of personal strength. It was an admission that he needed God. Meanwhile, arrests continued to separate believers from the Eucharistic gathering. Christians held in prison could no longer stand among their brothers and sisters or extend their hands to receive the bread of life. Their absence caused pain throughout the community, for the Church understood itself as one body. If one member suffered, all suffered. The prisoners needed food, messages, prayer, and the assurance that they had not been forgotten. Above all, those facing possible death longed for the sacramental presence of Christ. The question of how to reach them would soon enter the gathering where Tarcisius served. For now, the young acolyte continued his duties, while sensing that the peaceful pattern of earlier days was drawing toward a test. The danger that had once lived in old stories was now breathing beyond the door. And beyond that door were brothers and sisters whose imprisonment could separate them from daylight, but not from the Church's love. Roman confinement was often a place of waiting, rather than a punishment carefully separated from trial and sentence. Those arrested might be held in dark, crowded rooms, while officials decided their fate, and the conditions could be harsh. Food was limited, air was poor, and the kindness of relatives or friends might determine whether a prisoner received the simplest necessities. For Christians, this meant that the community could not regard arrest as the end of its responsibility. A believer taken from a home remained a member of the same body. His hunger belonged to them. Her loneliness entered their prayers. When a family lost the person who earned its bread, others quietly supplied what was missing. When prisoners needed clothing, water, or medicine, someone looked for a way to bring it. Every visit involved danger, because those who showed concern for accused Christians could attract suspicion themselves. Yet love kept seeking paths through locked doors. Tarcisius would have heard the prisoners mentioned during the prayers of the faithful. Their names may have been spoken softly, one after another, followed by a silence filled with concern. Some were people he knew. He might remember an older man who had once greeted him after worship, or a woman who had brought food for the poor, even when her own household possessed little. Others were known to him only through the sorrow of their families. A child might ask when a father would return. A wife might wait for news from an official who offered no clear answer. The Christian gathering held these uncertainties before God, not pretending that grief had already passed, but trusting that no prison wall could prevent Christ from seeing those enclosed within it. Tarcisius began to understand that prayer was itself a way of refusing to let another person disappear. Among the imprisoned were believers who expected to be questioned about their faith. Roman authorities might ask them to perform a religious act that appeared small. Place incense before an image, pour out a little wine, or speak words acknowledging the divine claims of the emperor. To an observer, such a gesture could seem harmless. To Christians, it would contradict the worship owed to God alone. Some prisoners had little time to prepare for this test. They had been taken suddenly from ordinary work or from the evening meal. Now they sat in confinement, listening to footsteps in a corridor and wondering whether the next voice would call their names. They were not made of stone. They missed their families, felt the weakness of hunger, and knew that pain could frighten even a sincere heart. What sustained them was not a desire for death, but the conviction that Christ had entered suffering before them and would not abandon them within it. The community sought to strengthen that conviction through every means it possessed. Messages of encouragement were carried when possible. Passages of Scripture were recalled from memory. The prisoners were reminded that the Church prayed with them and that believers throughout the world confessed the same Lord. Most precious of all was the hope that they might receive the Eucharist. To those who expected death, Holy Communion was not merely consolation added to their final hours. It was Christ Himself, given as food for the passage from this life into eternity. The Church would later use the word viaticum for this sacred provision, a word suggesting nourishment prepared for a journey. The prisoners were approaching a road no friend could walk in their place, yet they would not travel without the Lord, who had promised to be the resurrection and the life. Tarcisius had already seen portions of the Eucharist reserved for believers, unable to attend the assembly. Now that practice acquired a human face. He imagined the moment when a prisoner, exhausted by uncertainty, would receive the consecrated bread. The cell would remain narrow. The guards would still stand outside. The sentence might not change. Yet within that place of earthly powerlessness, Christ would come with the fullness of divine love. The prisoner would be joined sacramentally to the altar, to the community, and to the sacrifice of Calvary. No chain could restrain that communion. No official decree could make the Lord absent from a faithful heart. For a boy devoted to the Eucharist, the thought must have been both beautiful and painful. The sacred gift was near, while those who needed it most remained beyond reach. Practical difficulties surrounded every attempt to serve them. Adults known as leaders of the Church were watched closely. A bishop, priest, or deacon moving toward a prison might be recognized. Even ordinary believers could be searched if their behavior attracted notice. Bribing a guard was not always possible and could expose both visitor and prisoner. The Eucharist had to be carried with absolute reverence, concealed without being treated as something shameful. It could not be handed to an unreliable person merely because the need was urgent. Courage, discretion, and the ability to move through Rome without appearing connected to the Christian community. These considerations would soon turn the eyes of the faithful toward someone young enough to pass beneath suspicion. Before that decision came, however, Tarcisius's desire to help continued to mature. Perhaps he assisted in gathering bread for prisoners' families, or carried a message to someone waiting for news. Such tasks brought him close to grief that could not be quickly repaired. He may have entered a home where a place at the table remained empty, and where every sound from the street caused someone to look toward the door. What could a child say in such a room? Often there were no words. He could deliver what had been entrusted to him, remain respectfully present, and carry the family's gratitude back to the community. Through these visits, compassion ceased to be a general feeling. It became the willingness to bear a small part of another person's burden. Tarcisius also learned that the imprisoned believers were not only receiving help, their witness was strengthening those outside. Reports came that some had answered questions with gentleness, refusing both denial and anger. Others had shared food with fellow prisoners or comforted people who did not share their faith. Even in confinement, they continued to serve. Their freedom had been taken, yet their capacity to love remained. This was another quiet reversal of Roman power. The state could close a door upon the body, but it could not command the soul to hate. A prisoner who forgave a guard possessed a liberty no emperor could bestow or remove. Tarcisius listened to these reports and recognized the same grace he had encountered in the Eucharist. Christ gave himself entirely, and those united with him learned to offer themselves. Night after night, the needs of the prisoners remained before the community. Each gathering ended with the knowledge that some members returned to homes while others returned to cells. Their separation felt unnatural because the Eucharist had made them one. Tarcisius could no longer hear of their longing without feeling a personal call. He had no authority to open the prison and no wealth with which to influence officials. He owned no weapon and commanded no protector. What he possessed was youth, an unnoticed appearance, practiced discretion, and a heart increasingly willing to serve. These seemed like very small gifts beside iron doors, yet God had often chosen small things to carry great mercy. Somewhere behind stone and iron, the faithful were waiting, and love was already seeking a road toward them. The road toward the prisoners could not remain an idea. Someone would have to walk it. During one of the Christian gatherings, after the scriptures had been proclaimed and the Eucharist celebrated, the need of those in confinement returned with particular urgency. Perhaps news had arrived that several believers would soon be brought before an official, or that one prisoner had grown weak and feared death was near. Whatever the immediate cause, the community understood that delay might mean the captives would face their final trial without receiving Holy Communion. The sacred bread had been reserved for them, but between the quiet room and the prison stood the watchful streets of Rome. The believers remained for a time in prayer, seeking wisdom rather than allowing fear or haste to decide the matter. A mission born from love still required prudence. If the messenger were recognized and searched, the Eucharist could be profaned, the prisoner exposed to further cruelty, and other Christians placed in danger. A priest or deacon might seem the natural person to go, but the ministers of the church were among those most likely to be watched. Several adults may have considered offering themselves, and then recognized that their faces, occupations, or connections were already known to local authorities. The silence in the room was therefore not the silence of unwillingness. It was the stillness of people measuring a responsibility too holy to accept carelessly. Tarcisius listened from the place where he had been serving. He knew the roads. He had carried messages without attracting attention, and had learned not to reveal what had been entrusted to him. More importantly, he loved the Eucharist, and had spent many quiet hours observing the reverence with which it was guarded. Yet he was young, and youth brought both weakness and possibility. A child moving through Rome might appear to be running an ordinary household errand. Soldiers who would question an adult connected with the church might scarcely notice him. The very thing that seemed to make him unsuitable could become his protection. This thought did not come to Tarcisius as a desire for adventure. He was not imagining himself admired by the congregation or remembered as courageous. He was thinking of the prisoners. Their cell, their loneliness, and their longing for Christ had become more real to him than the dangers he could not yet see. At last, according to the tradition cherished by the Church, Tarcisius stepped forward and offered himself. His words did not need to be elaborate. A simple request was enough. "Send me." Those who heard him may have looked first with surprise and then with concern. Perhaps someone assumed that the boy did not understand what he was asking. Another might have remembered a child in his own family and felt instinctively that such a mission belonged to older shoulders. The priest responsible for the Eucharist would have known that innocence alone was not a shield against violence. Rome could be cruel even to the young when suspicion became anger. To place the Blessed Sacrament in Tarcisius's care was to entrust both a sacred mystery and a beloved member of the community to an uncertain road. The priest therefore hesitated, not because he doubted the boy's devotion, but because genuine love does not send another person into danger lightly. He may have reminded Tarcisius that the journey required more than quick feet. The Eucharist must be protected under every circumstance. The messenger could not display it to satisfy curiosity, abandon it when frightened, or save himself by handing it to anyone who demanded to see what he carried. If stopped, he would have to remain calm. If followed, he would need to alter his course. If the prison could not be reached safely, he must return without exposing the sacred gift. Tarcisius listened to each warning. The seriousness of his expression would have shown that he did not regard the task as a game. Still, could any child fully imagine what violence would feel like before it arrived? Courage does not require complete knowledge of the future, for such knowledge would make many human decisions impossible. It requires enough understanding to choose what is right, and enough trust to leave what cannot be foreseen in the hands of God. Tarcisius possessed that trust. He may have explained that his youth would help conceal the mission. An adult carrying himself with unusual caution might draw attention, while a boy passing through the streets could disappear into the ordinary life of the city. The priest had also witnessed his formation. He remembered the lamps tended without being asked, the messages delivered faithfully, the confidences kept, and the reverence Tarcisius showed whenever the Eucharist was present. The offer before him had not risen from a sudden wish to prove himself. It was the flowering of many hidden acts of service. Others in the room would have recognized the same truth. The young acolyte was physically small, but his heart had been prepared. A long silence may have followed, as the community considered whether accepting his offer was an act of trust or an unbearable risk. Within that silence, Tarcisius had time to withdraw. No one would have condemned him. He could have stepped back, admitted fear, and allowed another way to be sought. The absence of shame is important, because Christian sacrifice has meaning only when it is freely offered. Tarcisius was not forced forward by adults eager to protect themselves. Tradition remembers him precisely because he chose to go. His decision arose from the love of Christ and of Christians who waited behind prison walls. He did not know whether he would be successful, but he knew that someone must try. The priest finally accepted his offer. That consent did not fill the room with excitement. If anything, it deepened the solemnity. Some may have lowered their heads in prayer. An older believer may have looked upon Tarcisius with both admiration and sorrow, sensing that the innocence before them was entering a world from which it might not return unchanged. Yet no one could see the entire road. They could only entrust the messenger to God and prepare him as carefully as possible. Tarcisius himself may have felt fear when the decision became real. Before volunteering, the mission had existed in imagination. Now he would soon feel the weight of the sacred gift against his body and hear the door close behind him. The streets he had walked many times would become a passage filled with hidden risks. Fear, however, did not cancel his willingness. He allowed it to lead him toward prayer. He remembered the martyrs whose resting places he had visited and the prisoners whose courage had strengthened the church. Above all, he remembered Christ, who had freely set his face toward Jerusalem, not because suffering was desirable, but because love called him forward. The boy's mission was infinitely smaller than the sacrifice of the Lord, yet it drew its meaning from that same self-giving love. No trumpet announced his decision. A child simply opened his hands and offered the little strength he possessed. Because those young hands had learned faithfulness in small things, they were now entrusted with the Church's greatest treasure. The gathering became still as preparations for the mission began. Outside, Rome moved according to its usual pace, unaware that within an ordinary room a decision had been made that would outlive the reign of emperors. No splendid vessel or procession marked the moment. There were no bells, banners, or crowds kneeling along the road. Such signs of public devotion belonged to a distant future, when Christians would worship openly and churches would rise where secrecy had once protected the faithful. For Tarcisius, the Eucharistic Lord would be concealed beneath humble coverings and carried close to the body of a child. The simplicity of the arrangement did not lessen its sacredness. It revealed again the manner in which Christ had chosen to remain with his people. Quietly, vulnerably, and under appearances the powerful world could easily overlook. The priest called Tarcisius near and looked upon him with the seriousness of one who understood both the holiness of the trust and the danger surrounding it. Perhaps he asked once more whether the boy was ready. Tarcisius could not promise that he would feel no fear, nor could he know every obstacle he might encounter. But he could repeat his willingness. The response may have been only a nod, a quiet affirmation offered without display. Around them, the other believers prayed. Some asked that angels accompany him. Others prayed that guards would look elsewhere, that crowded streets would open before him, and that the prisoners would remain alive until he arrived. A mother may have prayed for him as she would have prayed for her own child. An elderly Christian, remembering earlier persecutions, may have understood more clearly than the young messenger how quickly an ordinary journey could turn dangerous. All placed their concern into the hands of God, not demanding a miracle, but asking for grace, sufficient for whatever the road contained. The Eucharist had been consecrated during the sacred celebration and reserved with profound reverence. The priest now placed the Holy Sacrament within a clean linen covering or small container suitable for concealment. Tradition has pictured Tarcisius receiving it against his breast, beneath his garment, where his folded arms could protect it without immediately revealing what he carried. The precise form of the vessel is unknown, but the spiritual meaning is unmistakable. The body of Christ rested near the beating heart of a young Christian who had received the Lord many times in Holy Communion and now received him as a sacred charge for others. Tarcisius did not possess the Eucharist as one possesses an earthly object. He was its servant. The gift belonged to Christ and was destined for members of Christ's suffering body. His task was to carry, guard, and deliver, adding nothing of himself except faithful love. The priest gave final instructions in a low voice. Tarcisius should avoid the busiest streets when possible and stay away from places where games or public spectacles gathered unpredictable crowds. He should not run unless danger required it, because haste might attract attention. He must not stop for idle conversation or allow familiar companions to delay him. If someone questioned him, he should answer without revealing the mystery. If the road became impassable, he should turn back rather than risk unnecessary exposure. Above all, the Holy Eucharist must never be handed to anyone who sought it out of curiosity, mockery, or hostility. Sacred things were not to be displayed as entertainment before those who wished to profane them. These instructions were practical, yet each carried the weight of devotion. Tarcisius listened carefully, repeating the route within his mind. He knew the turns that would lead him toward the place of confinement. He knew where a market might slow his progress and where soldiers were sometimes stationed. Perhaps arrangements had been made with a Christian near the prison who could help him gain access. Much depended upon circumstances beyond his control. A guard might be replaced, a gate closed, or a street blocked. The boy could prepare, but he could not command the city to make way. This awareness encouraged humility. Success would require not cleverness alone, but providence. When the priest finished speaking, he may have placed a hand gently upon Tarcisius's head and invoked God's protection. The blessing joined the present mission to every earlier moment of the boy's formation. The sign of the cross, once traced by a guiding hand in childhood, now marked him as he prepared to carry the sacramental presence of the crucified and risen Lord. Tarcisius may have remembered the stories of messengers throughout Scripture. Angels announcing divine promises, prophets carrying difficult words, disciples sent by Jesus into towns ahead of him, and the women hurrying from the empty tomb with news of the resurrection. His mission was quieter. He would proclaim nothing aloud. His message was hidden and yet complete, for he carried Christ himself. The prisoners waiting for him did not need an argument or explanation. They needed the bread of life. For a few moments before departing, Tarcisius remained in prayer. The room around him faded from his attention as he became aware of the nearness of the Eucharistic Lord. He may have prayed for a steady mind, for restraint if someone mocked him, and for strength not to betray the trust placed in him. Perhaps he prayed that he might reach the prisoners quickly. Perhaps, with the honesty of a child, he also asked to return home safely. A desire to live would not diminish his courage. Life was good, and the people who loved him were precious. Christian martyrdom was never contempt for life. It was the refusal to preserve earthly life by abandoning the one who gives it eternal meaning. Tarcisius did not leave expecting death. He left hoping to complete an act of mercy. Yet somewhere within his prayer, he placed even the possibility of suffering before Christ. His arms settled firmly around the sacred deposit. The gesture was protective, but it was also almost an embrace. He remembered that the Lord he carried had once been carried as a child in the arms of Mary. The Son of God had accepted human weakness so completely that he depended upon a mother's care, fled danger beneath Joseph's protection, and grew within the hidden life of Nazareth. Now, beneath the appearance of bread, he accepted the guardianship of another child. What a strange and tender reversal this was. Tarcisius knew that Christ possessed all power and did not truly need human defense. Yet divine love permitted the boy to serve, just as it permits every believer to participate in works God could accomplish without them. The mission therefore became a gift to Tarcisius as much as a responsibility. He was being allowed to love through action. Those gathered watched as he prepared to leave. No one knew what words were adequate for farewell, so the silence itself became a blessing. The prisoners were before him, the praying church behind him, and Christ rested close to his heart. He drew a breath, turned toward the doorway, and waited as it opened upon the brightness and noise of the city. Then the door opened, and Tarcisius stepped from the shelter of the church into the uncertain morning of Rome. Outside, the city continued as though nothing holy were passing through it. Sunlight lay across walls and rooftops, warming the pale stone and drawing sharp shadows beneath balconies and archways. Voices rose from nearby shops. A baker lifted fresh loaves from an oven, sending the familiar fragrance of bread into the street, while a craftsman struck metal with steady blows that echoed between the buildings. Sellers arranged vegetables, olives, and jars of oil before calling to those who passed. A cartwheel caught briefly in a worn hollow, and the driver urged his animal forward with impatient words. None of these ordinary sounds changed when Tarcisius appeared. No one stopped to look at the young figure walking with measured steps, his garment drawn close, and his arms resting naturally across his breast. To every casual observer, he was one more child moving through the daily life of Rome. Yet beneath that unremarkable appearance, the Eucharistic Lord was traveling toward Christians who waited in captivity. Tarcisius resisted the temptation to hurry. The priest had warned him that unusual haste could awaken curiosity, and so he tried to move as he would on any familiar errand. This was more difficult than he had imagined. Every moment seemed precious because the prisoners might soon be questioned or led away. His heart wished to run, while prudence told his feet to remain calm. He discovered that courage could require restraint as surely as action. A messenger who allowed urgency to govern every movement might endanger the very gift he hoped to deliver. Tarcisius therefore placed his impatience into prayer. With each breath, he recalled that Christ was near, the Lord who had waited 30 hidden years before beginning. His public ministry could guide a boy through a few slow streets. At the first turning, Tarcisius passed neighbors who knew his face. One greeted him casually, perhaps asking where he was going. The boy answered without dishonesty, but without revealing more than safety allowed. He had been given a task, he might say, and could not remain to talk. The neighbor accepted the explanation and returned to work. The exchange lasted only a moment, yet Tarcisius felt the tension it left within him. Until then, concealment had seemed simple. Now he understood that every familiar voice could present a choice between courtesy and caution. He did not wish to appear fearful because fear attracted questions. Nor did he wish to be rude because Christian service did not excuse unkindness. He learned to pass gently without being delayed. The city unfolded before him in a series of small trials. A group gathered near a fountain, forcing him to move closer to the wall. Soldiers crossed an intersection ahead, their equipment catching the light. Tarcisius lowered neither his head nor his pace, for an obvious attempt to avoid them might seem suspicious. He let them pass, while hearing the hard rhythm of their sandals and the brief clatter of metal. One soldier looked in his direction, but saw nothing worth examining. The boy continued, grateful without allowing relief to make him careless, and on another street led beside a public shrine where incense curled before the image of a Roman deity. Citizens paused to offer a gesture of respect. Tarcisius walked on quietly, neither mocking their worship nor joining it. Against his heart, he carried the one whom he believed to be the true bread from heaven. The contrast did not fill him with pride. It deepened his gratitude. Faith had been given to him as mercy, not as a reason to despise those who did not share it. Perhaps some of the people passing the shrine would one day hear the gospel. Perhaps one of the soldiers would discover Christ through the courage of a prisoner. God alone knew the hidden journeys of the souls surrounding him. Tarcisius had been entrusted with only one path and one duty. As the distance from the gathering place increased, so did his awareness of vulnerability. He could no longer turn back within moments if something went wrong. The room where the Christians prayed was now concealed behind streets and walls, while the prison still lay ahead. He found himself between places, held only by the mission and the presence he carried. This condition resembled the life of faith itself. Believers had left behind the security offered by conformity to the world, yet they had not reached the heavenly homeland they desired. They traveled as pilgrims, sustained by promises and sacraments. Tarcisius's walk through Rome became a small image of that greater pilgrimage. He could not see the destination from every turn, but he knew toward whom he was walking. At moments, the linen covering beneath his garment seemed almost weightless. At others, the responsibility felt heavier than anything he had carried before. He kept one arm resting securely near it, careful that the gesture did not appear strained. He remembered the words proclaimed during worship. Christ had taken bread, blessed it, broken it, and given it to his disciples. The Lord had made himself food for people who were weak, frightened, and divided. Now he was being carried to men and women whose physical hunger and spiritual longing had been intensified by confinement. Tarcisius imagined the prisoners receiving him. He saw in his mind a dark cell becoming, for one sacred moment, a sanctuary. This image renewed his purpose whenever uncertainty tightened around his heart. A burst of laughter from nearby children drew his attention. They were playing in an open space, absorbed in a game that required quick feet and loud encouragement. Tarcisius recognized the uncomplicated happiness of it. On another day, he might have watched or joined them. He was still young, and the mission had not erased the ordinary desires of youth. For an instant, he felt the distance between himself and their freedom. They carried nothing that required secrecy. They could run wherever the game led them. Tarcisius continued walking, not because play had become unworthy, but because love had asked something else of him that morning. Sacrifice often begins not with pain, but with the quiet surrender of an innocent alternative. The sounds of the game faded behind him. Farther along, clouds moved slowly above the city, crossing the sun and softening the light. A breeze stirred loose fabric and carried dust across the road. Tarcisius welcomed the coolness. He may have whispered a brief prayer to the Blessed Virgin Mary, remembering how she had carried Jesus beneath her heart and journeyed with Joseph through danger. She had not been protected from uncertainty, yet she had trusted the word of God. Her hidden courage offered companionship to a child entrusted with her son's sacramental presence. He asked that his steps remain steady and his heart remain pure. Then he prayed for the prisoners by name, where he knew their names, and for all the others whose suffering was known only to Christ. The route brought him nearer to broader roads and places where the movement of people became less predictable. He reviewed the priest's instructions and chose a quieter way where he could. Nothing openly threatening had occurred, yet the absence of danger did not mean the trial was over. He sensed how easily attention could be awakened by a wrong turn, an unexpected meeting, or one curious question. Still, peace remained beneath his watchfulness. It did not arise from confidence that nothing painful would happen. It arose from the knowledge that whatever happened, Christ was already with him. The prison still lay ahead, but the true trial had already begun in the quiet guardianship of each step. And sometimes the gravest danger does not arrive wearing a soldier's armor, but with the familiar face of someone who knows our name. Tarcisius had been careful along the first part of the road, choosing quieter streets and moving with the composed manner he had been taught. Yet no route through Rome could remain entirely separate from ordinary life. The city drew people together at fountains, corners, workshops, and open spaces where children gathered after their household duties were finished. As Tarcisius approached one of these places, he heard voices that seemed familiar. A group of boys stood near the roadside, speaking loudly and teasing one another in the carefree manner of those who believed the day belonged to them. Perhaps one or two had played with Tarcisius before. They may have known him from the neighborhood, from a shared errand, or from the games children invented whenever adults were occupied. He recognized their gestures and the rhythm of their laughter. They recognized him as well. One called his name and waved him over. The invitation was innocent at first. They asked where he was going, why he seemed in such a hurry, and whether he could stay for a while. Tarcisius slowed, but not stop completely. He knew the mission required him to avoid unnecessary conversation, yet refusing familiar companions could appear strange. He answered politely, explaining that he had something to deliver and could not join them. The boys protested in the mild way of friends who assumed a small delay would do no harm. They told him that the game had just begun and that one more player was needed. Someone laughed and accused him of becoming too serious. Another stepped into his path, not with hostility, but with the confidence of a child accustomed to being obeyed by other children. Tarcisius smiled if he could, then tried to move around them. His attempt to continue awakened curiosity. Why was he so determined to leave? What did he carry beneath his garment? Had someone sent him on an errand that must be kept secret? Children notice small changes quickly. They saw that Tarcisius held his arms more closely than usual, and that his attention returned again and again to the place beneath his clothing. To them, the gesture suggested a hidden object. It might have been a gift, a letter, a valuable belonging, or something that could be used to surprise the others. Their questions grew more insistent. Tarcisius refused to answer directly. He did not want to lie, but neither could he explain that he was carrying the sacramental body of Christ. The sacred mystery was not his to display. He had been entrusted with it for a specific purpose, and the trust required silence. The boys interpreted his silence according to their own assumptions. One suggested that he had stolen something. Another imagined that he was hiding money. Someone else reached toward his garment in playful imitation of a search. Tarcisius stepped back and covered the Eucharist more firmly. The movement changed the atmosphere. What had begun as teasing now contained the first edge of conflict. He asked them to let him pass. His voice may have remained calm, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. The boys were no longer interested merely in playing. They wanted to know what he guarded so carefully. A secret possesses a strange power over curiosity. The less Tarcisius explained, the more valuable the hidden object seemed. His companions began to surround him without fully realizing what they were doing. The road behind him remained open, yet the space between the boys narrowed. He considered whether he could turn and find another route, but any sudden movement might provoke pursuit. He also feared that running would confirm their suspicion and draw attention from passers-by. The priest had instructed him to avoid crowds and now an ordinary encounter was becoming the very danger he had hoped to avoid. Tarcisius prayed inwardly for patience. He did not want to see his companions as enemies. They had begun with an invitation, not an intention to harm. If they had understood what he carried, perhaps they would have responded differently. Yet ignorance could quickly become cruelty when mixed with mockery and the excitement of a group. The boys' voices rose. One demanded that Tarcisius show his hands. Another called him frightened. A third laughed and said that no ordinary errand required such protection. Their words struck more deeply because they came from people close to his own age. Tarcisius had been taught that Christians were to pray for those who misunderstood them. But prayer did not prevent the pain of being misunderstood. He felt the lonely distance that can arise even when one is surrounded by others. His companions knew the boy he had been in their games, but they did not understand the faith that now directed his steps. He could not share the secret to make himself understood. To protect the Eucharist, he had to accept their judgment. A child who wishes to remain welcome among friends naturally wants to explain himself. Tarcisius had to surrender that desire. He could not prove that he was trustworthy by revealing the very thing he had been trusted to hide. This was the first deep test of his mission. The priest had warned him about physical danger, but the heart also faces danger when others laugh at what it holds sacred. Tarcisius might have handed over the covering merely to end the questions. He might have said that there was nothing important inside and invited them to search him. He might have tried to appease the group with a joke. Yet each possibility threatened the dignity of the Eucharist. He remembered that sacred things were not to be treated as objects for amusement. The bread of life was offered to those who approached with faith, not exposed to satisfy a crowd's curiosity. His refusal was therefore not stubbornness for its own sake. It was reverence. The group did not understand this distinction. To them, refusal appeared like defiance. One boy seized Tarcisius by the arm. Another tugged at the edge of his garment. He pulled away and called for them to stop. A few people passing along the street glanced toward the group, but did not yet intervene. Perhaps they assumed the children were merely quarreling over a game. In a city accustomed to noise, the beginning of violence could appear ordinary. Tarcisius looked toward the road ahead and saw that the prison remained somewhere beyond the crowded streets. He could no longer imagine reaching it easily. The mission had become a struggle to preserve the sacred gift even before the boys understood what they were attempting to take. His heart beat faster. Fear pressed against the prayer he had been repeating. He asked Christ to protect the Eucharist and to forgive those who were now surrounding him. The request for forgiveness came before the worst had occurred, showing how deeply the gospel had entered his formation. He did not know whether he would be able to maintain peace if the boys struck him. He knew only that hatred must not become the answer to hatred. Then someone noticed the small mark of Christian identity that Tarcisius wore or had once revealed. Perhaps he recognized a prayer, a gesture, or a name familiar from the neighborhood. The accusation moved quickly through the group. He was a Christian. The words changed everything. Curiosity became suspicion, and suspicion found permission to become anger. In the minds of those who did not understand the faith, Christianity could seem like disloyalty to Rome or a strange refusal to participate in the life of the city. The boys may have repeated charges they had heard from adults, not realizing how deeply such words could wound. Tarcisius no longer stood before companions merely as a child with a hidden object. He stood before them as one of those Christians whom society had begun to fear. The road remained visible before him, but a circle of human suspicion had quietly closed around his path. Within that narrowing circle, the boy had only one freedom left: the freedom to remain faithful. The first hands that reached toward him may still have been uncertain, more curious than cruel, but the mood of the group had changed. When people gather around a person they have decided is strange or guilty, each individual can become bolder than he would have been alone. A boy who might not have struck Tarcisius privately could now imitate the anger of others. A question became an accusation. An accusation became an order. The group demanded that he reveal what he carried beneath his garment. Tarcisius answered that he could not. He did not explain the Eucharist because explanation would have required him to expose it. He did not insult them or call upon the authorities. He simply held his arms more firmly across his breast and tried to continue toward the prison. That simple movement became an act of confession. It declared that something sacred had been placed in his care, and that no pressure from the crowd could change the obligation he had accepted. The boys pressed closer. They pulled at his sleeves and tried to force his hands apart. Tarcisius turned his body so that his breast remained protected. He may have stumbled when someone pushed him, then recovered his footing and continued to refuse. The struggle was not dramatic in the manner of a battlefield. It was confused, uneven, and frightening. The kind of violence that can grow from several small acts before anyone understands how far it has gone. Tarcisius was surrounded by those who had once seemed familiar. Their faces were near him, their voices loud, and their hands stronger than his own. Yet the mystery he carried remained beyond their reach. He had been warned that the Eucharist must not be treated as an object to be displayed before people who sought it with contempt. Now the warning became real. The crowd wanted to see, touch, and perhaps mock what they did not understand. Tarcisius knew that surrender would not merely end the struggle. It would betray the purpose for which he had left the Christian gathering. Behind the prison walls, believers were waiting for the same Christ he protected. He could not choose the easiest path simply because the danger had become immediate. Fear rose within him like a physical force. His body wanted to escape. His mind searched for a way to persuade the boys that nothing valuable was hidden beneath his clothing. But the truth could not be spoken safely, and no ordinary explanation would satisfy those who had already decided that he must be hiding something. He could have claimed that the object belonged to another person and asked them to let him pass. He could have promised to show it later. He could have placed it upon the ground and run. Each thought appeared briefly and disappeared beneath the memory of the priest's instructions. The Eucharist was not his to bargain with. He had received it to carry to the prisoners, and his life could not be separated from that sacred responsibility. The first blow may have come suddenly. A fist struck his shoulder, or a stone thrown carelessly found its mark. The crowd reacted with excitement rather than concern. One person's violence made another believe that violence was permitted. Tarcisius fell or was forced against the roadside, but he kept his arms folded protectively over the Eucharist. Later tradition would remember clubs and stones, while the early inscription of Pope Damasus speaks more generally of a furious group pressing the holy Tarcisius and beating him to death. The exact sequence cannot be reconstructed, but the central truth remains clear. He was attacked because he would not reveal or surrender the sacred mysteries he carried. The narration should linger not upon the physical details, but upon the spiritual reality of that refusal. His body was vulnerable, but the treasure did not depend upon the strength of his body. It depended upon his fidelity. The boys may have shouted that he was foolish, stubborn, or afraid. Their words could have wounded him almost as much as their hands. To be mocked by strangers is painful. To be attacked by people one once regarded as companions creates another kind of sorrow. Tarcisius did not merely face bodily pain. He faced the collapse of ordinary trust. The game, the laughter, and the familiarity of the first encounter had disappeared. In their place stood suspicion fueled by ignorance. Yet even as the crowd harmed him, Tarcisius prayed for them. He may have remembered Saint Stephen, who saw the heavens opened while stones fell around him, and asked God not to hold the sin of his attackers against them. Tarcisius was too young to imitate Stephen perfectly in his own strength, but the same grace was alive in the church that had taught him. Forgiveness did not mean pretending that the violence was harmless. It meant refusing to allow violence to dictate the condition of his soul. Christ had suffered at the hands of those who did not understand him, and Tarcisius now placed his own suffering within the Lord's wounded love. The crowd tried repeatedly to separate his arms. They pulled at the covering near his breast. Tarcisius pressed the Eucharist closer. His elbows, shoulders, and hands became a living shield. He did not use them to strike back. He used them to protect. In that posture, his entire body became a prayer without words. The Christians who had gathered in secret had taught him to approach the sacred mysteries with reverence. Now his reverence took the form of endurance. He could not kneel in a peaceful room or bow before the altar. He could only remain faithful in the place where the world had become hostile. This was the terrible beauty of his witness. The Eucharist was not protected by a soldier, a wall, or a weapon, but by a child who chose to suffer rather than permit profanation. The road beneath him grew rough. Dust entered his clothing. The noise of the city continued nearby, indifferent to the struggle. People may have passed without understanding what they were seeing. Some might have watched from a distance, unwilling to become involved. Others may have assumed that the quarrel concerned a stolen object or a private insult. The hiddenness of the Eucharist meant that no outward sign announced the value of the thing being defended. Tarcisius alone, and perhaps heaven, knew the full meaning of the struggle. This is often how faithfulness appears in the world. A person may seem unreasonable to those who cannot see the love guiding the choice. An act that looks small or stubborn from the outside may contain an entire life of devotion. The crowd could see only a boy refusing to open his hands. It could not see the altar, the prisoners, the prayer of the church, or the presence of Christ. Tarcisius's strength began to fail. His breathing became difficult, and his movements slowed. Every effort to protect the Eucharist demanded more than his body could give. Yet the sacred gift remained secure. He may have repeated the name of Jesus beneath his breath. Perhaps he prayed the Our Father. Or perhaps no words remained, and only the intention of his heart endured. Christian prayer does not depend upon eloquence. When suffering takes away speech, love itself can become prayer. The boy's silence was not emptiness. It was filled with surrender. He offered his pain for the prisoners he had hoped to reach, for the church that had entrusted him, and even for the companions whose violence had placed him upon the ground. Those who attacked him might have grown confused when they failed to find what they sought. They could strike the body, pull at the garment, and demand an explanation, but they could not force the sacred mystery into their hands. Their anger could not conquer what they did not understand. Tarcisius's refusal therefore became more powerful as his body became weaker. The world measured power by the ability to compel another person. Christ revealed power through the freedom to love without surrendering truth. Tarcisius possessed no control over the crowd, yet he retained the deepest liberty of all. He could choose what he would give and what he would not betray. His body was being overcome, but the secret held against his heart had not been surrendered. What the crowd could not take by force, Tarcisius now carried toward the threshold of eternity. The violence around him had begun to weaken, whether because the attackers grew tired, because passers-by approached, or because their anger had spent itself without achieving its purpose. The ancient testimony does not preserve every detail of the scene. It does not name the companions who surrounded him or describe the exact wounds that brought him down. It gives us the essential truth in solemn language. While carrying the sacraments of Christ, Tarcisius preferred to surrender his life rather than expose the heavenly body to profanation. Later tradition would fill the silent spaces with a more detailed account, remembering the young martyr beaten along the Appian Way and rescued by a Christian soldier named Quadratus. These details should be received as part of the Church's devotional memory, held with affection, but not confused with the limited facts known from the earliest witness. Whether Quadratus arrived during the final struggle or shortly afterward, the image of another believer lifting the wounded boy has endured because it expresses something true about Christian love. No martyr belongs to himself alone. The Church accompanies the suffering, even when it arrives late and can do little to prevent the pain. According to the tradition, Quadratus had served in the Roman military and secretly believed in Christ. He saw the crowd breaking apart and found Tarcisius lying upon the road. Perhaps he recognized the signs of a fellow Christian, or perhaps someone nearby told him the boy had been attacked for refusing to surrender the Eucharist. He would have understood the danger immediately. If the mob returned, both men could be harmed. If the sacred gift remained exposed, the mission would end in tragedy. Quadratus therefore moved toward Tarcisius and carried him away from the place of violence. The strength of the soldier's arms contrasted with the weakness of the boy's body. Yet Quadratus could not carry the burden as Tarcisius had carried it. He could lift the child, protect him from further blows, and seek the help of the Christian community. But the choice Tarcisius had made belonged to Tarcisius alone. The boy's blood had already marked the road, and his breath was becoming faint. As Quadratus moved, perhaps Tarcisius opened his eyes. He may have recognized the sign of a Christian brother, and the fear that had accompanied him through the streets may have softened. He was no longer surrounded by a hostile crowd. He was being carried toward the church he had hoped to serve. Yet the prison still waited somewhere ahead, and the Eucharist had not reached the prisoners. The mission, judged by ordinary measures, had failed. Tarcisius had not arrived at the cell. He had not placed the sacred bread into the hands of those who were waiting. But the mystery of Christian faith cannot be measured only by visible completion. He had remained faithful to the end. The Eucharist had not been treated as a thing to be negotiated, abandoned, or surrendered. The love intended for the prisoners had become a sacrifice offered upon the road. Christ had received the boy's willingness and transformed the interrupted journey into a witness that would speak for centuries. It may seem painful that such a young life should end before he could carry out the simple mercy for which he had volunteered. Yet martyrdom is not a reward for achieving a planned result. It is the offering of oneself when fidelity becomes costly. Tarcisius had set out to bring Christ to prisoners, and in the end, he became a living sign of Christ's own self-giving love. The road to the prison was not completed, but another road had opened before him, one that led beyond Rome, beyond persecution, and beyond death. The Church would later speak of him as a martyr of the Eucharist, because the sacred mystery remained at the center of his final act. Even so, the narrative should not imagine that Tarcisius understood everything with adult clarity. I was a child or very young servant, according to the tradition, and children do not calculate eternity as theologians do. His courage was not the result of having solved every question about suffering. It was the result of loving someone he trusted. He knew Jesus as the Lord who had welcomed children, fed the hungry, suffered upon the cross, and promised to remain with his disciples. In the moment of danger, that personal trust became stronger than the instinct to protect himself at any cost. Faith often operates in this way. It does not offer the heart a complete map of every future sorrow. It gives the heart a person to follow. As Tarcisius lay in Quadratus's arms, he may have felt the closeness of the Eucharist beneath his garment. Perhaps he was still trying to protect it, even in weakness. Perhaps his fingers remained closed around the covering, or perhaps his arms had become too exhausted to move. The tradition says that when he was brought to the priest, Tarcisius was already dead, yet he still clutched the small linen cloth containing the Eucharist. Other traditions, preserved in devotional memory, say that the Blessed Sacrament was no longer found upon his body, neither in his hands nor in his clothing. This absence has sometimes been understood as a gentle miracle, suggesting that Christ had received the offering and was no longer visibly present in the form carried by the boy. History cannot verify what occurred, but the spiritual meaning of the tradition is clear. Tarcisius had not died protecting an empty symbol. He had died in the presence of the mystery he loved. Whether the sacred host was found, consumed, or otherwise removed before his death, the essential truth remains that his reverence was directed toward Christ himself. He did not cling to an object for its own sake. He guarded the sacramental presence because he believed the Lord had entrusted himself to the Church. In the Christian imagination, the mystery of the Eucharist has always included both presence and concealment. Christ is truly given, yet not displayed according to the expectations of the world. Tarcisius's final hours reflected that mystery. The crowd saw only a wounded boy. They did not see the hidden Christ he carried, nor understand that the boy's strength came from communion with him. The sacred treasure remained veiled, even as the witness became visible. When Quadratus reached the Christian community, grief would have met him at the door. Those who had sent Tarcisius might have hoped to hear that he had reached the prisoners. Instead, they received the body of the young servant and the account of what had happened along the road. Their sorrow would have been deep and immediate. The boy had been entrusted to them, and they had accepted his offer. Perhaps some wondered whether they had asked too much of him. Perhaps the priest who had placed the Eucharist in his care carried a burden of painful remembrance. Yet within their grief, they also recognized the grace that had sustained him. Tarcisius had not died because the church was careless with sacred things. He had died because hatred confronted a love that would not surrender. The community could mourn without believing his life had been wasted. They could weep for the child and praise God for the courage given to him. Christian mourning does not require a choice between sorrow and thanksgiving. The same heart can ache because a beloved person is gone, and rejoice because that person has been received into eternal life. The prayers offered over Tarcisius would have joined his death to the death and resurrection of Christ. The Eucharist he had guarded was the sacrament of the sacrifice he now shared. His life had begun in the ordinary shelter of a Christian family and ended upon a public road. Yet both places belonged to God. The house, the hidden gathering, the prison, the road, and the grave became connected through one act of fidelity. The boy who had carried Christ through Rome was now carried by Christ beyond every road of suffering. Yet death did not erase the boy from the church's memory. It gave his hidden fidelity a place among the martyrs. The Christians who received Tarcisius's body would have faced the practical sorrow that follows every death. They needed to prepare him for burial, find a safe place, and decide how his story could be preserved without placing living believers in unnecessary danger. In a time of persecution, even mourning required courage. A public funeral could draw attention, while a hurried burial might seem to diminish the dignity of one who had offered his life for Christ. The church sought a path between fear and display. Tarcisius was not a soldier returning from battle with banners before him. He was a young servant whose body had been broken on an ordinary road. Yet the community knew that the dignity of a martyr did not depend upon earthly ceremony. The Lord who had seen his secret devotion also saw the care with which his brothers and sisters laid him to rest. Tradition connects his burial with the cemetery of Calixtus along the Appian Way, among the tombs of other Christians who had died in fidelity to the gospel. This association is fitting, whether every detail of the original burial can be established or not. The Appian Way had witnessed the final movement of his earthly life, and the cemetery became a sign that his death was not understood as an isolated tragedy. He belonged among the witnesses. The Christians who carried him toward the catacomb would have walked with a grief different from the sorrow of those who buried someone after a long illness. Tarcisius had left them alive and hopeful, carrying the Eucharist to prisoners. He returned as a martyr. His death had been sudden, violent, and painfully young. There was no opportunity for a final farewell in the ordinary sense. Perhaps his companions remembered the way he had bowed before the altar, the quietness with which he accepted responsibilities, or the seriousness in his eyes when he volunteered. In the hours after his death, small memories would have become precious. A gesture that once seemed insignificant could now reveal the person he had been becoming. The Church has always understood that holiness often becomes clearer after a life has ended. While a person is living, attention may rest upon ordinary habits, flaws, and unfinished tasks. After death, the pattern of faithfulness can be seen more clearly. Tarcisius's final act gave meaning to the earlier acts that had prepared him. The lamps he tended, the messages he carried, the prayers he learned, and the Eucharist he received were not separate from his martyrdom. They were the path that led toward it. The burial itself may have been simple. A body was wrapped, prayers were spoken, and the grave was marked according to the means available. The Christian community could not build a monument equal to those raised for emperors, but the burial ground possessed a deeper kind of dignity. The dead rested among the faithful, and their graves became places of remembrance and hope. A Christian entering the cemetery would not see only the ending of earthly life. He would see names awaiting resurrection. The inscriptions often used brief words of peace, hope, or union with Christ. The body returned to the earth, while the Church confessed that death did not have the final word. Tarcisius's grave became part of this sacred landscape. Those who knew him could return and pray. Those who had not known him could learn that a young servant had died while carrying the sacraments of Christ. His story would pass through the community first as memory, then as testimony, and eventually as a written witness. In the centuries after his death, the Roman Church endured further trials and changes. Emperors rose and fell. Policies toward Christianity shifted. Some persecutions ended, while other struggles emerged. The community that had once gathered quietly in homes and burial places eventually worshipped with greater freedom. As years passed, details about early martyrs could be forgotten, confused, or adorned by the affection of believers. The Church treasured stories, but she also needed to preserve the truth within them. This is why the inscription associated with Pope Damasus is so important. Damasus served as Bishop of Rome during the 4th century, when Christians could begin honoring the martyrs more openly. He composed verses for their graves and had inscriptions placed at sites connected with those who had witnessed to Christ. His purpose was not merely to decorate stone with beautiful language. He wanted pilgrims and the faithful to know where the martyrs had been buried and why their memory mattered. In the poem dedicated to Tarcisius, Damasus places him beside Saint Stephen, the first martyr. Stephen had been stoned while proclaiming Christ, and Tarcisius, carrying the sacraments, had also been attacked by a raging crowd. The comparison joins the young Roman martyr to the wider history of the Church. His suffering was not an isolated legend, but part of the same witness that began in Jerusalem and spread throughout the world. Damasus's words preserve the essential event with remarkable economy. They do not provide the name of Tarcisius's parents, the details of his childhood, or a complete account of the journey. They do not tell us exactly how old he was or identify every person involved. Instead, they testify that a holy man named Tarcisius was carrying the sacraments of Christ when a furious group pressed him to reveal them to the uninitiated. He preferred to give up his life struck down, rather than betray the heavenly members to those who would profane them. Such language is poetic, yet it communicates a historical memory the Church considered trustworthy. Tarcisius had access to Roman traditions concerning the martyrs, and his inscription was placed in connection with Tarcisius's tomb. The surviving poem, therefore, stands as the earliest firm testimony to his death. It also reminds later listeners to distinguish what is known from what devotion has added. The Church does not need invented details to make Tarcisius holy. The truth already possesses a quiet power. A Christian carried the Eucharist. A hostile group demanded that he expose it. He chose death rather than profanation. Everything else should serve that center rather than obscure it. The inscription's comparison with Saint Stephen also invites a deeper reflection. Stephen preached openly before his accusers, while Tarcisius served silently upon a road. Stephen's words were remembered in the Acts of the Apostles, while Tarcisius's witness was preserved in a few lines carved upon stone. Yet both reveal the same grace. Holiness does not require one outward form. Some saints are called to speak, others to suffer in silence. Some defend the faith through teaching, others through mercy, and others through the refusal to surrender what has been entrusted to them. Tarcisius's silence was not a lack of testimony. His body, his folded arms, and his fidelity spoke more clearly than an argument could have done. The Christian community returned again and again to his resting place, not because they worshipped the dead, but because the memory of the martyr directed them toward Christ. They prayed for the grace to imitate his reverence, especially when approaching the Eucharist. They remembered that the sacred mysteries were not ordinary possessions, and that receiving communion called them to live with equal seriousness. Tarcisius became a mirror in which believers could examine their own hearts. Did they receive Christ casually? Did they forget the poor and imprisoned? Did they allow fear to make them silent when faithfulness required courage? His life offered no easy accusation, only a quiet question. If a child could treasure Christ above his own safety, what should adults do with the greater understanding and freedom given to them? Beneath the earth, the grave of Tarcisius rested among the graves of the faithful. Above it, Rome continued to change. The empire that had once threatened the Church would eventually yield space to Christian worship, but the triumph of Christianity did not make the martyr's sacrifice unnecessary. Every generation still needed to learn that power without love is fragile, and that faithfulness often begins in hidden places. Carved in stone was not the measure of his years, but the measure of his fidelity. From that brief inscription, the memory of Tarcisius began a journey far longer than the road he was prevented from completing. The Church carried his name from one generation to another, not because his biography was extensive, but because the little that was known contained a profound mystery. He had no recorded sermons, no public office, no writings, and no political influence. His life did not unfold across many decades. Yet in the small space preserved by the witness of Pope Damasus, believers recognized a complete act of love. Tarcisius had been entrusted with Christ, and he had remained faithful when faithfulness demanded everything. As the centuries passed, Christians returned to that truth whenever they needed to remember what the Eucharist meant. The sacrament was not merely a ceremony inherited from the past. It was the living presence of the Lord who had loved his people unto death and continued to give himself as food for their journey. Tarcisius became a quiet guardian of that understanding. His name traveled through the catacombs, churches, schools, devotional books, and the memories of families teaching children how to approach the altar. With time, later traditions filled in aspects of his story that the earliest sources had left silent. He was increasingly pictured as a boy, a young acolyte, and a messenger carrying Holy Communion to Christians condemned or imprisoned. These details helped generations imagine the human shape of his sacrifice. They gave children someone near their own age to admire, and adults a story through which to teach reverence. Yet the heart of the devotion remained faithful to the ancient witness. The details were not meant to distract from Christ, but to show how grace can work through a person who appears small, unnoticed, and powerless. The image of Tarcisius carrying the Eucharist became especially meaningful as Christian communities developed more visible forms of worship. When churches could be built openly, when bells could ring above the streets, and when processions could pass through public squares, believers still remembered the time when the sacred mysteries had to travel quietly beneath a garment. The contrast between public splendor and hidden devotion gave his story lasting tenderness. Gold vessels and beautiful altars could express the honor owed to Christ, but the Lord had also chosen to be carried in a simple linen covering by a frightened child. The Eucharist could be celebrated in a cathedral filled with light, or received in a prison cell beneath the watch of guards. Its dignity did not depend upon the grandeur of the place. Christ remained present, as he had promised to remain with his church. Tarcisius's witness helped believers understand that reverence is not measured by outward beauty alone. It is measured by the love with which the sacred gift is approached, protected, and received. In later centuries, writers and artists gave the young martyr a visible face. One influential retelling appeared in Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman's 19th-century novel, Fabiola, which portrayed the underground Christian world of Rome and introduced Tarcisius to many readers through a fuller devotional narrative. Literature naturally shaped the way people imagined him. Paintings and sculptures showed a youthful figure holding the Eucharist close to his chest, sometimes with the wounds of martyrdom visible upon his body, and the expression of a child transformed by grace. Such images were not photographs of a life no artist had witnessed. They were invitations to meditation. A person standing before them could see the fragility of the human body and the strength of a heart given entirely to Christ. The images also offered children a saint who did not seem remote. Tarcisius was not always represented as an elderly scholar or a powerful preacher. He was shown as someone who had grown into holiness while still young, through courage, reverence, and service. For altar servers, his example became particularly close. Each time a child carried a cross, candle, book, or vessel near the sanctuary, the memory of Tarcisius offered a quiet companion. The task might seem small or repetitive. A server might wonder whether anyone noticed a careful movement or a moment of concentration. Tarcisius answered through his life that hidden service has eternal value. The altar is not a stage, and serving there is not an opportunity to be admired. It is a way of helping the church worship and of placing one's young strength at the disposal of Christ. The same lesson reaches those preparing for First Holy Communion. Children often approach the Eucharist with a mixture of wonder, nervousness, and incomplete understanding. They cannot yet explain the full depth of the real presence, but they can love Jesus sincerely. Tarcisius reminds them that the Eucharist is not an ordinary object or a casual habit. It is a gift that deserves attention, gratitude, and care. His story can be told without frightening them, emphasizing not the violence of his death, but the tenderness of his devotion. He loved the one he received, and that love made him brave. The Church has therefore regarded him as a patron of altar servers and first communicants, especially those who wish to serve near the Eucharist with a faithful heart. His feast is associated with August 15th in the Roman Martyrology, though that date is also occupied by the great solemnity of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The coincidence creates a beautiful spiritual connection. Tarcisius, who carried Christ beneath his garment and surrendered himself in love, is remembered on the day when the Church celebrates Mary being received body and soul into heavenly glory. Mary was the first living tabernacle, the woman who carried the Son of God within her and remained faithful beneath the cross. Tarcisius's devotion can therefore be contemplated alongside hers. He did not replace the Virgin's unique role, but he reflected in a small human way the courage of carrying Christ and remaining faithful when the world could not recognize the mystery. His story also reaches beyond Catholic communities into the wider Christian memory of martyrdom. Christians of different traditions have honored him as a young witness of the early Church, while his image has appeared in churches, devotional calendars, and educational materials. The name Tarcisius has been given to schools, youth groups, altar server associations, and houses of formation. Each use of his name carries an invitation. It asks whether the Church still teaches children that holiness is possible, whether adults still protect the innocence of faith, and whether the Eucharist remains the center of Christian life rather than an occasional custom. His witness is not an argument for seeking danger. It is a reminder that love for Christ must become concrete when circumstances demand a choice. Most believers will never face a crowd on an ancient road. They will not be asked to defend the Eucharist with their bodies. Yet they may face quieter pressures, embarrassment about faith, indifference toward worship, fear of speaking truth, or the temptation to treat sacred things as ordinary. Tarcisius stands beside these moments, not as someone who condemns weakness, but as someone who points toward grace. He teaches that fidelity begins before the crisis, in the daily habits of prayer, honesty, reverence, and service. When a difficult moment comes, the heart usually reaches for what it has practiced. His final courage was nourished by many small acts that no one applauded. This is why his story remains especially valuable for older listeners who have spent decades watching the world change. Empires have disappeared. Governments have risen and fallen. Technologies have transformed daily life, and public values have shifted. Yet the human heart still longs for meaning, belonging, forgiveness, and hope. The Eucharist remains what it was for the prisoners of Rome, Christ giving himself to his people, accompanying them through weakness, suffering, and death. Tarcisius's life does not ask listeners to return nostalgically to an ancient world. It asks them to recognize the same Lord present in their own time. When they kneel before the tabernacle, attend Mass in a quiet parish, receive communion beside strangers, or pray for the sick and imprisoned, they stand within the same living tradition that formed the young martyr. The road he walked has become part of a greater pilgrimage. It leads from the hidden rooms of Rome to churches scattered across the world, from the grave of a forgotten child to the hearts of those who still speak his name. Perhaps somewhere tonight, an altar server is preparing candles for the next celebration. Perhaps a child is learning to bow before the Eucharist. Perhaps an elderly believer, listening in the quiet hours, is remembering a first communion, a beloved parish, or a lifetime of prayers offered before the Blessed Sacrament. Tarcisius belongs to all these moments because his witness was never ultimately about his own greatness. It was about the greatness of the Christ he carried. The boy who seemed powerless became strong because love gave him a freedom no persecutor could remove. He could not control the crowd, save himself from pain, or complete the road according to his original plan. But he could remain faithful. And that was enough for grace to transform a brief life into a lasting testimony. Whenever the Eucharist is received with reverence, whenever a servant approaches the altar with humility, and whenever a Christian chooses love over fear, the memory of Tarcisius rises again. He walks beside the church not as a shadow of tragedy, but as a quiet companion pointing toward the Lord who gives himself completely. And so, whenever love kneels quietly before the Eucharist, the unfinished footsteps of Tarcisius seem to continue on their way.